Tortoise is a newsroom that believes in slowing down to make sense of the world. And on Tortoise News, you get 3 shows that do just that. The Sense Maker brings you one story every day to make sense of the world. Journalists and special guests debate what should lead the news on the news meeting. And in Trendy, Britain's leading polling expert John Curtis and policy guru Rachel Wolfe explore trends in society and public opinion. Make sense of the world by searching for Tortoise News in your podcast app.
Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines Magazine podcast. I'm Faisal Al Yafai, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. And then, all of a sudden, people around America this week were Googling the name JD Vance. The announcement of the Ohio senator as Donald Trump's running mate marked the end of an extraordinary week for Trump and for American politics. It's not often here on The Lead that we feature 2 consecutive episodes from the same country, but it's not often that a prospective, perhaps now presumptive, American president survives an assassination attempt. On Saturday, July 13th, former President Trump was speaking at a rally in Pennsylvania when a barrage of gunfire rang out around the venue. Photographs showed bullets narrowly missing Trump's head, with one piercing the upper part of his right ear. He was then whisked away by Secret Service agents, but not before pumping his fist in front of his cheering supporters and creating a truly iconic, regardless of your politics, photograph. Just 2 days later, Trump announced the Ohio Senator JD Vance, who once compared him to Hitler, as his running mate. Vance, a 39-year-old former venture capitalist, has turned into one of Trump's most reliable supporters and laid the blame for Trump's attempted assassination on the narrative portraying Trump as an authoritarian. In this episode, I speak to Meredith McCarroll, the author of Unwhite, Appalachia, Race and Film, and co-editor of Appalachian Reckoning, A Region Responds to Hillbilly Elegy, the memoir set in Appalachia that JD Vance wrote. But before that, I spoke to Danny Postel, New Lines' politics editor, who has been on the ground at this week's Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, where Trump, who leads Joe Biden in the polls, was officially announced as the Republican candidate for this year's presidential election. And I started by asking him what the mood was like on the ground in Milwaukee.
I would describe it as jubilant. I would say the Republicans gathered here, the delegates to the convention, and other Republicans who came to Milwaukee for the RNC are overjoyed. They're feeling, I think correctly, that they are in a commanding position and that Trump is poised to win, if not by a landslide, then quite comfortably. They're feeling very, very good about the prospects of Trump's candidacy, both because of Biden's disastrous debate performance and what the aftermath of that disastrous performance in terms of the polls and in terms of the national conversation, but also because of the assassination attempt on Trump.
So this is what I wanted to ask you. Do you think that this, if the RNC had happened a week ago, that same level of jubilation would be there?
I sensed that there was a very confident feeling, even before the assassination attempt, talking to Republicans and Trump campaign people. They were feeling very good about how Biden's debate performance was playing out, both in terms of national polling and in terms of the fracturing of the Democratic Party, all of the soul searching and this open wound that the Democrats have in front of them and not knowing what to do. It's not clear what's going to happen on the Democratic side. And that has meant very good things for Trump, obviously. So I think it was already looking very good for the Trump campaign. But I think since the assassination attempt, and everybody here has brought it up, it's definitely brought people together within Trump world in a newfound way. There's a sense of rallying around the leader. And it's interesting to hear people talk about how the rhetoric has toned down, as they like to say, on all sides, right?
So when you say that they keep bringing it up, I mean, when you're moving around the convention, the bars and the restaurants and stuff, what do you mean by they keep bringing it up?
Well, when I ask Republicans gathered here how they're feeling about the convention, about the party, about Trump's prospects in November, the assassination attempt, it looms very large in conversations. I don't have to bring it up. They bring it up immediately. And they seem to feel that it has changed the equation and given people a sense of, you hear a lot of religious language, for example, divine intervention.
Right.
This is God's will. Trump himself is using this language. And you can imagine how people who were already predisposed to this sort of theological interpretation of things and who already see Trump as a kind of divine messenger, you can imagine how this sort of interpretation just resonates for them.
Yeah.
So yeah, even if it's not explicitly religious, there's just a lot of people are mentioning it as something that has brought the Republican Party together, that has given them a perspective that this is a life and death matter, that people want their leader dead. The word that keeps coming up is unity. There's a sense of unity both within the Republican Party around Trump. Like Tuesday night, for example, several of the speakers at the convention were opponents of Trump's. Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, who both ran against him in this primary, 2024. They both delivered addresses on the floor of the convention and were fully all in for Trump. And I think that so a lot of the Republicans I've spoken to have said, look at this. No matter who people may have voted for in the primary, no matter where people stood about who should be the nominee of the party this time around, everyone is behind Trump now. There's no more bickering, no more animosity. The case is closed. Everyone is all in for Trump.
And what do you think the assassination attempt means for his presidential bid? Because I know you felt in the immediate aftermath that it was a net positive for his campaign. I think you already interpreted it as the people in the Republican Party who like him, the MAGA heads, are going to see it as a messianic message.
Yes, but I think it won't change people's actual votes. I think it's changed the emotional temperature in the country. I mean, it's done a few things. One thing is that it has shocked people, and it's led to a kind of both sides language in the national conversation, right? Like, we all need to tone it down, folks. We need to bring the rhetoric into check here. We need to be more measured. And several people have pointed out that, yes, there is heated rhetoric on both sides, both pro and anti-Trump, but actually over the last 8 years, on balance, the majority of the kind of language of demonization, of antagonism, of division has actually been from the Trump side of the equation. And in fact, the political theorist Jeffrey Isaac has pointed out that, in fact, the increase in political violence, the increase in the language and the ideology of political violence has actually been Trump's main legacy thus far. But getting back to your question about the impact of the assassination attempt, it's definitely changed the emotional temperature all around, both within the Republican camp, but also, I would say, outside as well, because Democratic leaders have gone out of their way to denounce not only what happened over the weekend in Pennsylvania, but also the language of political antagonism and so forth, the heated rhetoric. But it's also, I would say that I don't think the assassination attempt will change anyone's votes. I cannot imagine a single person who was not already planning to vote for Trump before the assassination attempt suddenly deciding, oh, I'm voting for Trump now because someone tried to take his life. I just don't see that.
But perhaps it has made people more likely to turn out for him.
I doubt that very much. I think that Trump's base is already fired up at 100%, and it doesn't go any higher than 100%. I think everyone who would possibly have voted for Trump was already going to vote for him. This is the most fired up base in modern American political history. There are people who feel more passionately about Trump and say so explicitly than they've ever felt about a political candidate in their lives. Many people have said they never felt any emotional connection to any candidate, whether they voted for them or not, until Trump. The emotional intensity at the heart of Trumpism is so palpable and so strong. I just don't think that any pro-Trump people were not already going to vote for Trump, and now they are. I don't believe that it will change the vote count at all. But I don't think that matters, because it's pretty clear that with Biden's disastrous debate performance and the bloodletting in the Democratic Party about what to do next, Trump was already ahead in the polls. So I just don't think that this assassination attempt is going to change the outcome of the election. I think Trump was already poised to win. It remains poised to win. And I think that on balance, we're going to see that the assassination attempt really will not have affected the outcome of the election.
You've been in Milwaukee. You've not been hitting the convention floor so much as you've been talking to some of the characters on the fringes of the events. What have you picked up from those conversations?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say fringes. What I'm doing is I'm talking to people in the area outside of the convention hall where the convention is taking place. So I'm talking to delegates. I'm talking to Republican elected officials from all over the country who have come to Milwaukee to participate in the delegation. And I'm talking to them on the street, at bars, at restaurants, on the sidewalk. And there's just an enormous sense of unity, I would say, of joy. I mean, you can see it visibly. There's the talking points. There's what people say. But then you can also just see it in their body language. They're very confident. There's a sort of strut in their step. They know that they're in a commanding position. They know that things look really good for them in November. And there's a sense in which the debate about whether Trump is the future of the Republican Party, it's hard to remember now that just 2 years ago, around the time of the midterm elections of 2022, there were deep questions about whether Trump was going to be the nominee. His preferred candidates in the midterm elections did very poorly. There was no red tsunami. People were pointing the finger at Trump. Fox News didn't even cover his announcement speech that he was running for president from Mar-a-Lago. They started to cover it and then they turned away from it. So there was a sense that like Trump was the past, not the future of the Republican Party. That was just 2 years ago. It's incredible now how dramatically that has all shifted in these last 2 years, less than 2 years. Trump is unquestionably the standard bearer of the party for a third straight time. And this convention is really a unity convention. Like everybody who previously criticized him, including his vice presidential pick, JD Vance, his running mate, who was very anti-Trump several years ago. He said some extremely damning things about Trump, which are now coming back and being re-examined. But there's a lot of Trump skeptics and never Trumpers and anti-Trump people and people who ran against him they're done with that. They're in the fold. They've bent the knee, however one wants to look at it, but they're all on board for the Trump campaign. And he has solidified his control over the Republican Party.
When you were wandering around Milwaukee this week, you said to me that you had a entertaining but also quite an illustrative anecdote about where the Republican Party is. And it came through the meeting of a rapper, which I wonder how many of our listeners are familiar with, a rapper called Forgiato Blow.
That's right. I was at a restaurant last night in Milwaukee, in downtown Milwaukee, not far from the convention site. And I was at a table right next to a group of Republican delegates who were having dinner. They were, based on the way they were dressed and their conversation, which I could overhear a bit, these are professional Republicans. I didn't talk to them, so I don't know exactly who they were or where they were from, but they're delegates, right? They represent the professional class of Republicans.
Yeah, by professional Republicans, you don't mean that is what they did as their employment. What you mean is that these are the people who make the party work, who are at every convention every year or every 4 years, regardless of who the nominee is.
That's exactly right. And now these are Trump delegates because Trump is the nominee. But there are the kinds of people that voyage to the Republican National Convention every 4 years, and this is true on the Democratic side as well, are people who are deeply invested in party politics. These are real. This is very different, say, from a Trump rally. And as you know, I was at a Trump rally also in Wisconsin, in Racine, Wisconsin, just a few weeks ago, which is a completely different scene. This is a ground up, grassroots, you see people in T-shirts and with tattoos and with all sorts of regalia. It's a totally different, these are not people who are involved with the Republican Party as such necessarily at a Trump rally. Whereas at the Republican convention, you see people in fancy suits, people who have flown in from all over the country and who in many cases are elected officials. They hold office. I've spoken to all sorts of Republican officials from Utah, from Wisconsin, from Illinois, from all over the country, including from Puerto Rico, in fact. Okay, so I'm sitting at this table next to this group of professional Republican operatives, delegates. And towards the end of the dinner, this guy walks in who looks like he just came from a Trump rally, in fact. So these worlds sort of collide. He's got tattoos everywhere, including on his face. He's a big, kind of burly guy, and he's wearing a MAGA hat. He's dressed very differently from them, and they're all taking selfies with him. He's positioning himself around the table at different places so that everyone can get a selfie with him, and there are group portraits, and I'm really I didn't know who the guy was. I didn't recognize him, and I was intrigued. So as he was walking out of the restaurant, I walked up to him and had a conversation with him, and it turns out to be a rapper called Forgiato Blow. He does songs about Trump, about the MAGA movement. He's been called the king of the MAGA movement. He's this rapper and cultural figure. He's also an entrepreneur, and he manages other celebrities and influencers. He's very close with Amber Rose. They've appeared at various Trump events together on stage. They've made videos together.
Yeah.
So,
Amber Rose, many of our listeners will already know, Amber Rose spoke this week at the RNC. But you interpreted that as something different about the type of support that Trump now has within the Republican movement, the wider Republican movement, I mean.
Yeah, there's a lot of figures like this, these sort of people who were not really political before, or perhaps were political but not Republicans. These are people outside of the normal kind of demographics or constituencies that the Republican Party appealed to before Trump became the standard bearer of the party. He's brought in a lot of these people, and for various reasons that one can explore. But so what was interesting to me was, and Forgiato Blow is one of many of such people, they do very much see Trump as belonging to their world. And in fact, he did. He inhabited that world for a very long time as a tycoon, as someone with a reality television show with The Apprentice and Celebrity Apprentice, as someone who was very involved in the world of wrestling and the WWE, and someone who was seen as very comfortable in a sort of trashy cultural space like wrestling, right? Trump would literally get into the ring and be in the arena with these people. He's always been about pageantry, right? The beauty pageants, Miss World, Miss Universe.
Yeah.
I mean, his popular culture, his footprint in the pop cultural realm has made him a figure who was even in actually someone who was referred to by a lot of rappers. 50 Cent, for example, would often refer to Trump in his lyrics.
Well, he Trump kind of, before his political career, kind of epitomized this idea of unabashed spending of money, the idea that when you make it, you demonstrate that you've made it. You put your name on buildings in New York.
That's right. And so there's a connection there to this realm of people who are not the traditional Republican types, who are not really the kinds of people who would have gotten excited about a Mitt Romney or a John McCain, and probably not about George W. Bush either, let alone his father.
Before we get to Vance, I wondered what you thought of the choreography of it all. I was thinking back to when Biden chose Kamala Harris, and there was none of this celebrity apprentice rundown of who might be the running mate, who's in, who's out. But that was completely what happened with the VP pick. How do you think that choreography plays with the public?
This Veep stakes, they're called. That's a term.
Yeah.
Veep stakes are very big in American politics. Like, people actually love that. So I've spoken to a lot of the delegates and Republicans here about this, and most of them didn't really have a strong pick or a strong preference for the final three. It was widely reported that the final three were JD Vance, Doug Burgum, governor of North Dakota, and Marco Rubio, senator from Florida. And I think Rubio was by far the best known of those three. But Vance, the people I've spoken to have generally been quite enthusiastic about Vance, even ones who didn't prefer him. He wasn't their number one pick, for example, or preferred running mate. They seem to think that he's a strong pick. That's what I keep hearing from people, that it was a decision made out of strength. Who does Trump need, right? That's often the question when it comes to a vice presidential pick. Who does the presidential candidate need to bring on board some constituency that's on the fence or that they don't quite have in their corner yet? So what does so-and-so add to the ticket, maybe regionally, maybe in terms of being a woman, in terms of being a member of a racial or ethnic group or a religious group, what have you. And there was some speculation that Trump would perhaps do that by picking Marco Rubio or picking an African American or picking a woman, because it's well known that there are a lot of, they're sometimes called Biden Republicans, these suburban women with college degrees in the professional classes who have been Republicans but are quite worried about the direction of the party or are not voting for Trump because of the reproductive rights issue or what have you. It would have made sense, the thinking went, for Trump to pick a woman, maybe even a pro-choice woman or a moderate, to win those women back. But he didn't. He actually picked someone who really, on the face of it, doesn't seem to add anything obvious that Trump doesn't already have. He comes from the white working class, JD Vance, right? He famously wrote a book about it, Hillbilly Elegy. He comes from a Midwestern Rust Belt state, Ohio, but it's not a swing state. Ohio is a solidly red state now. So it didn't seem to add anything. He's already got that demographic, if you will, of white working class men. So what was the Vance pick about then? The sense that I've gotten talking to Republicans here is that it was from a position of strength. Trump doesn't feel that he needs anybody. He's already got everyone he needs. He's got everybody on board. He's going to win the election. He feels very confident about that. And so by picking Vance, it was a choice that he made about what kind of Republican Party he wants to see moving forward. It's a thoroughly Trumpified, MAGAfied Republican Party. Vance is ideologically in lockstep with Trump, and he's very young, and he's a lot more, if you will, intellectually and ideologically clear-minded about what Trumpism is. Like, he can explain Trumpism in a way that Trump himself doesn't really. He compliments Trump in that way. He's kind of an intellectual voice of Trumpism, if you will.
You were saying to me earlier that now that you are there and you see how this Republican Party is rallying around the Trump flag, all of the former rivals turned up to kiss the ring, so to speak. Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, they all turned up at the convention and they were all full of praise for Trump. It feels very much like this is Trump's Republican Party now. Completely.
If there was any question about that before, which there wasn't much of, but there was maybe a shade of doubt left, there's no more. This convention solidifies that entirely and closes the case on that. And I think that that's a source of tremendous jubilation for the pro-Trump forces who have gathered here. That has come across in all of my conversations with the delegates. But it's also a source of, I think, some shock and a shock of recognition for those who were holding out. You know, and I've talked to a lot of anti-Trump Republicans, both in Wisconsin and nationally, who who have been fighting the fight. I mean, there's different layers of them. Some of them left the Republican Party a couple years ago. Some of them were holding out hope that maybe Ron DeSantis or Nikki Haley would get the nomination. Some of them were hoping, once they realized that Trump was once again going to be the nominee, they were hoping that he would lose and that would force a reckoning within the Republican Party and that the fever would break and the party would recover from this Trumpism delusion that it's been under, this spell that it's under. None of that has come to bear. What's clear is that all of those hopes have been dashed now, and it is unquestionably Trump's party, whatever that may mean.
Danny Postel in Milwaukee. Trump is no stranger to the media. Since leaving the White House, he is not exactly hidden in the shadows and has continued to boost his profile on traditional and social media platforms in advance of his second presidential bid. His new running mate, JD Vance, is a frequent guest on conservative media platforms in the United States, but is less well known overseas. I spoke to Meredith McCarroll, who profiled Vance for New Lines in early 2023. And I started by asking her how she felt when Vance was confirmed this week as Donald Trump's running mate.
I think it was that unfortunate feeling of I told you so. It was not a surprise. It was what a lot of us had been worried about back in 2016 when he first entered the scene, that he really was doing what he needed to do in order to find himself in a position of power like this. So it was not a surprise. It was just that sense that we had been right all along and we wish that we had not been.
You, I think, in the essay that you wrote for us, which we'll get to, you seemed like you were very concerned by the ideas that he has and the ideas that he might promote while in government. When you saw the discussion around the way that the Veep nominee was broadcast to the world, did you feel like you guys are not taking this seriously enough?
Yes, I think that has been the sense that many of us have felt both about Trump back when he first entered the scene as he was running for president prior to the 2016 election. A lot of people kind of laughed and shook their head until they realized, oh, this is actually happening. And I think that part of what I was working to communicate in the piece that I wrote for New Lines is that we really need to take seriously the ideology of JD Vance and the ideology of Trump. And I cite in the piece Ta-Nehisi Coates, who has written extensively about these ideas and has been a real influence on the way that I'm thinking about them. But essentially the idea that if we are not taking them seriously, then we're really missing an opportunity to push back and to ask questions. And yes, there are things that worry me about his ways of thinking.
So let's think about some examples. You wrote in the piece, let us not misunderstand him as a passive figure with no clear agenda or regard him merely as a tool of Trump or the tech billionaire Peter Thiel, who donated millions to his campaign. What we understand about Vance depends on what we can understand about the complex positioning of a new white exceptionalism. Now, with the benefit of a year's hindsight and the knowledge that he might be in the White House in a few months, how do you want us to understand JD Vance?
I think that the simple answer is that I want people to understand him as someone who is willing to align himself and position himself in order to be in power. So he has been criticized for the fact that he has flip-flopped. Famously, he's been very critical of Trump, and now he's running with Trump. And I think this week his response to that was, I changed my mind. And we want people to be able to evolve in their thinking. But I think that if we're talking about someone who is going to be in a position of power like this, we also want them to be able to explain that and not make light of it. So the most sort of basic thing is that what I see about Vance as someone I've studied I'm not a political theorist. I am a scholar of Appalachian studies. And what I see when I pay attention to him is someone who has aligned himself in a really interesting way with Appalachia, or used his identity as an Appalachian just enough. I see him as really smart and really manipulative in order to be in the right place at the right time. And I also would say that what I would hope people would pay attention to is really, listening. It doesn't take a lot of digging, but listening to what he's saying and reading what he wrote in Hillbilly Elegy about government assistance, about poverty. He is coming from a lineage, and that lineage is Moynihan and Charles Murray. So those are the people. Charles Murray is a person that he cites. Charles Murray wrote the Bell Curve and is known for blaming the victim in that work. And also many people would consider Charles Murray a eugenicist. And that is a person that Vance cites in Hillbilly Elegy and whose ideas are shaping his own thinking. So those are the things that I just hope that people slow down and actually listen to what he's saying and read what he has written, because it's not really about interpretation. It's just, I think that a lot of people are not taking him seriously enough to listen to what he's saying. And that feels dangerous.
This white exceptionalism, this is something that in the essay you situate in a wider set of ideas. So you talk about how it derives, in JD Vance's telling, it derives more, as a quote, from frameworks of Black exceptionalism than American exceptionalism, and relies upon a history of the Appalachia region as, quote, not quite white or unwhite, which I think is your coinage, existing outside the realm of white American experience. You think that the experiences that he is talking about and reframing for a wider audience have been at the core of his thinking?
Yes, I think that he has done this very interesting self-positioning where he is placing himself as, he calls the book Hillbilly Elegy, so he's claiming this term that a lot of people in the region actually claim, but saying, Hillbilly Elegy, saying as if this is a region and a culture that is dead. So he is doing this positioning and really leaning into the ties that he has, which many people would say are very tenuous ties to the region. He was born in Middletown, Ohio, which is not Appalachia, but spent summers and visited with his grandparents in eastern Kentucky, which is Appalachia. So already his ties to the region are a little bit tenuous. That actually, I think, is not what upset people so much. It was more the ways that he is saying that he is from this place, and now that he has brought himself out of that place, he turns back and blames the people for still being in the situation that they're in, rather than looking at systems of poverty, rather than looking at institutions, rather than looking at the pharmaceutical industry and the opioid crisis that really targeted some of the places that he is talking about.
Yeah, that particular example is one that you talk about in the essay and exists in the book, where you ask, when he talks about his mother being a drug addict, you ask, why does he focus on his mother and her inability to kick her use of drugs, as opposed to the wider structural opioid crisis that enabled that addiction?
Right. And I think that as a memoir, it is his right to reckon with that personal part in any way that he wants to. I think that I would not ever try to tell an individual writer, no, you need to think about your mother's drug addiction differently. What happens is that he is shifting from telling a personal story. He shifts from a memoir into a critique of a region. The subtitle of the book is A Memoir of a Culture and a Region in Crisis. And so it's that shift that I think invites so much criticism. So anyone who has been working in the region by now really understands the fact that Purdue Pharma was targeting particular areas and is responsible for this opioid crisis. And to not position his mother's addiction in this broader context feels short-sighted when he has made the decision to move from his personal story to a story about the region. There's an opportunity to think more broadly that it's not just that he misses it, but he chooses not to take it because he is aligning himself with political thinkers that are not wanting to support social programming that would acknowledge systems of poverty. And instead, it's easier to say, no, this happened simply because individuals were lazy. I mean, he says, and I'll read a little bit from the essay that I wrote, Vance might have positioned himself as one of those down-home factory workers done good who can't stand the direction in which liberal elites are moving the U.S. But that isn't the story he tells. Instead of aligning himself with Appalachia and calling for the conservative turn to restore power to locals, he points out the reasons that the locals can't be trusted. He writes, public policy can help, but there is no government that can fix these problems for us. These problems were not created by governments or corporations or anyone else. We created them, and only we can fix them.
And how do you think, this is a very subtle, but I think very important difference, because as you identify, there are different conservative strains of view that could apply to what is happening in Appalachia. And he doesn't take the perhaps more mainstream conservative interpretation, which says that all you need for success is graft and determination. He seems to take let's say, a darker perspective, which says this entire region is in crisis or broken, and there's just nothing that can be done.
Well, that's what's so interesting and perhaps uneven about his position, is that he does sort of lean into that, what we often call a bootstraps narrative, that he, through hard work and determination, got himself up and out, and good for him. But at the same time, rather than, we talk sometimes about someone who climbs the ladder and then pulls the ladder out so no one else can climb up. That's a little bit more what I see him doing, because as soon as he gets out, he is seeing himself as an exception. And rather than saying, wow, it's too bad that this was so tough for me to be successful, and we shouldn't have to leave a place that we're from in order to find work. We shouldn't have to distance ourselves from the people who raised us. Instead, he gets out, turns back, and is very critical of the people who raised him in the place that he came from, and blames them for not being able to, I guess, get up and out in the same way that he did. So it's a little bit of both and. He is using a little bit of that bootstraps thinking in terms of himself, but he doesn't believe that the people of the region can work hard and better themselves. So it's a complicated, uneven position that I think he's using.
How do you think that the relationship between Trump and Vance will carry on? Because Trump's perspective and conservative perspective seems to be, it's not even that he believes in this bootstrap theory. He kind of believes almost in a great man theory of progress, that if you just get out of the way, if government just got out of the way, then the people who are as brilliant as me, Trump, will be able to advance. Ignore the fact that his father gave him $1 million to start his career.
Yeah, I don't know that I am fully prepared to answer that, just because, I want to make sure I stay in my lane and don't speak from a position that's not my own. What I can say as someone who has been paying attention to Vance since he came onto the scene is that I think that what is happening right now and what will continue to happen is that people will whisper in Vance's ear what he needs to lean into, how he needs to position himself. And if he needs to be a naive hillbilly, then I think he will play that role. There's a story that he includes in Hillbilly Elegy about being at Yale Law School and being invited to a dinner and not knowing which fork to use. And I later read, not confirmed, but read that Amy Chua was the person who told him to write that scene. So he's malleable. And so I think that if he is told that he needs to play a particular role in order to get a block of voters, then I think that he will do that. He does not strike me as someone who has really solid, this is what I believe in. And so that is what I would encourage people who are trying to understand this candidate. I would encourage them really just to go and listen to some of his speeches and see some of the things that he's saying. And you'll see the fact that he is very all over the place, that he has changed his mind a lot, and he says what needs to be said in particular moments. But I think that deep down, it feels to me like there is this thread of, I think that if folks listen to his speeches and read his words, you'll understand that the extension of doing what it takes to be in power is a scary outcome when we're thinking about him being in power at such a high level.
This has been The Lead from New Lines Magazine. You can find Meredith McCarroll on Twitter at Meredith_MCC. Her New Lines profile of JD Vance is called JD Vance and the Myth of White Exceptionalism, and will be linked in the show notes to this episode. Danny Postel is on Twitter at Danny Postel. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app, or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.